Crystal of Wisdom presents Rudeness or Civility, Real Friendship or Affability.
Look who's here! It's Gerald, my boy! I'm so glad to see you!
Shouted Aunt Frida, coming to the door of the house. At the door of the house stood a young guy about 18 to 20 years old, with a slender figure of slightly above average height, dressed in a winter jacket. Black hair peeked out from under a knitted hat. In his hands he held a large travel bag. But the most remarkable thing about him was his broad smile.
Hello, Aunt Frida. I'm very glad to see you too, and you are still as young and beautiful as ever,
said Gerald.
Oh, thank you, you're so kind.
Aunt Frida came closer. Gerald prepared to give his aunt a big hug, but she only held out her hand to him. For Gerald, it was somehow unaccustomed. It had been so many years since they had seen each other. Such a joy to see each other. But there was the same joy in Aunt Frida's eyes. Gerald decided to ignore it and handed his aunt a box in a smart package.
This is a present for you.
Oh, how nice.
Aunt Frida was embarrassed.
Tomorrow is Christmas and your arrival is already a great gift for us. Come on, get undressed. You must be tired. I'll make you some hot tea.
How beautiful it is here. Where is everybody? Where's Eric? Uncle Morton?
Morton isn't back from his trip yet. He's working as a driver on a big truck. He should be back soon. Eric is in his room. I'll go get him. Eric, come out quickly. Your cousin Gerald is here from America.
A large guy in his early 20s came out of the far room.
Hi.
Eric said, nodded his head slightly, and started to go back to his room.
Eric, this is your cousin Gerald. Come over and say hello. It's been so long since you've seen each other. You were just little kids back then,
said Aunt Frida. Eric came closer and extended his strong hand to Gerald. Gerald reached out too. Eric squeezed Gerald's hand so tightly that something crunched and his eyes skewed. But Gerald tried not to show it and still smiled broadly. Then Aunt Frida gave Gerald hot tea with berries and began to prepare the table. At that time, Morton, Eric's father, returned. He was also very large and looked like a bear.
Frida, who is our guest?
Morton asked, looking at the smiling Gerald.
Morton, this is our nephew Gerald. My sister's Esther's son. They live in America now.
How big he's grown,
Morton said. He came closer to Gerald and held out his huge hand. Gerald reached out his hand, and his hand sank into Uncle Morton's huge palm. Gerald wanted to close his eyes in anticipation of a firm handshake, but his uncle shook his nephew's hand gently and even smiled slightly. Then everyone sat down at the festive table in honor of Gerald's arrival. Aunt Frida asked her nephew about his life in America. Gerald told a lot of interesting things and smiled all the time. The next day, Uncle Morton showed his nephew his house and the yard around the house. There was a lot of snow in the yard, but all the paths were neat. There was also a dog of the Broholmer breed living in the yard. "That's our Bella," Uncle Morton said proudly, showing Gerald the dog. Eric spent a lot of time with Bella. She grew up with Eric and they were great friends. If Eric went away somewhere, Bella missed Eric. In the evening, Grandma Helga arrived for the Christmas celebration. She was also very happy to see her grandson Gerald again. When she met him, she hugged him and didn't let him go for a long time.
Grandma Helga, you look so beautiful,
said smiling Gerald.
You are so cheerful. I am very happy to see you.
Grandma Helga was embarrassed, but she was very pleased. She stealthily walked over to the mirror and fixed her hair. Then she asked Gerald about his mom, Esther, and said she missed her daughter very much. Before Christmas, Gerald gave everyone small gifts. Everyone was very pleased and had a lot of fun. Uncle Morton offered Eric to take his cousin the next day to their favorite mountain and show all the beauty of the local nature. Eric agreed, and Gerald was even very happy and thanked Uncle Morton for such an offer. The next morning they began to pack. Aunt Frida had prepared a meal. but Gerald asked Uncle Morton to take him to the nearest supermarket to buy some more familiar food for the road. Everything was packed into backpacks. Eric's backpack was large, and he had put a set of clothes in it for some reason. When Gerald asked him, why would he do that? They were going to be back in the evening. Eric looked at his cousin silently and continued packing. Without wasting any time, Eric and Gerald set off. Bella, of course, ran with them, wagging her tail merrily. It was very beautiful all around. They walked in silence. Gerald tried to ignore his silent cousin and admired the beauty of the snowy nature. As he passed the river, Gerald saw a thawed patch in which the water gurgled, and around it the ice was frozen in fanciful patterns.
Eric, look how beautiful,
shouted Gerald and went to the river. Eric stopped and roughly shouted,
Stop! Come back! Don't go!
And a few more rude words. Gerald didn't like it. He decided to ignore Eric's behavior as before and went to the river to take a closer look at the beauty. Gerald had never seen a thawed area on the river. It was always warm where he lived, and the rivers never froze. Meanwhile, Gerald was almost to the thawed area when the ice beneath his feet cracked and broke. Gerald fell into the cold water. Eric was already running as hard as he could toward the river and cursing loudly. Bella was the first to run to Gerald, grabbed the collar of Gerald's clothes with her teeth and began to pull him toward the shore. Eric ran up, lay down on the ice, reached out to Eric, grabbed his hand tightly and began pulling him toward her. After a while, Gerald was rescued, but his backpack with food was hidden in the water under the ice.
Is it cold?
Eric asked.
Very.
Gerald replied in a shaky voice.
I told you to stop, and you...
And Eric swore harshly again.
Let's go, get warm.
Eric went to the nearest trees. He stomped his feet in the snow and took warm clothes out of his backpack, handed them to Gerald, and told him to change into dry clothes immediately. He went to gather dry firewood. Half an hour later, the fire was already crackling in the clearing. Eric hung up Gerald's wet clothes and grumbled about how careless he was and how much time he had to lose. Gerald sat by the fire and tried to keep warm.
I'm hungry and my backpack is gone,
Gerald said regretfully when he felt that he had already warmed up. Eric silently shared the food with his cousin and covered him with his jacket.
What about you?
Gerald asked.
I'm not afraid of the cold.
Eric answered proudly. In an hour, the fire was put out, the things were packed, and the brothers moved on. After another hour, they climbed a rocky mountain. How beautiful it was here. From the height, they could see the surrounding forests. In the distance, they could see the river into which Gerald had fallen. Even farther away, the entire town where Eric's family lived was visible. Gerald sat down on a rock. Bella sat down next to him, and Eric walked around waving his arms, probably to keep warm.
Strange people here,
thought Gerald, wrapped in his cousin's warm jacket.
Why are they so unfriendly and cold like this snow? But at the same time, they are so kind. How is that possible? Why is Eric so rude? I didn't do anything wrong to him, did I? Why does he swear so harshly? He saved me and shared his food and clothes with me. So he's kind. Why is that? It's different where I live. I'm not used to it.
We have to go back.
Gerald's thoughts were interrupted by Eric's loud command.
We have to get there before the sun sets. We'll have to go very fast.
Before dark, the brothers returned home. A hot sauna was waiting for them at home. How nice it was to steam in the sauna after such a trip. In a few days, Gerald had to fly to his home in America. The whole family went to the airport to see the guest off. Even grandmother Helga saw her grandson off with a cheerful and important look. Gerald invited Eric to his house and smiled broadly as usual. Eric, as he did when they met, reached out his hand to Gerald, but did not squeeze it hard, smiled, and put his other hand on his cousin's shoulder. It was the biggest display of Eric's feelings. A few months later, as promised, Eric flew to visit his cousin, Gerald. Gerald lived in a small town on the west coast, not far from San Francisco. Eric was greeted at home by his Aunt Esther.
Eric, oh dear, I'm so glad to see you,
Said Aunt Esther with a big smile.
How are you doing? Come on in, how'd you get here, all right? Have a seat, tell me, how are you living there?
Good.
Eric answered, embarrassed, unable to keep up with Aunt Esther's questions.
How is my sister Frida? I miss her so much. How is Grandma Helga? How's her health?
She's fine.
Oh, you've told me so much, Eric. Gerald told me that it's very cold but very beautiful. He also told me that you're a taciturn but you're a true friend. I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
Eric got embarrassed and blushed a little.
And Gerald isn't home,
Aunt Esther went on.
but he promised to come. He's so busy, he's always going out, he has so many friends, he's so charming, he's so sweet, I love him so much. How does he have time to socialize with everyone?
With so many questions and exclamations from Aunt Esther, Eric could no longer make sense of the words. In his head, they blended into a song that made no sense at all. Eric liked to sit at the edge of the forest with his dog Bella and listen to the silence of nature. But he realized that now he was a guest and it would be very uncultured to answer Aunt Esther as he would like. So Eric silently looked out the window. But in the window he saw only houses, and behind the houses other houses, and so on ad infinitum. Eric thought about it. How good it was at home. But here it was different.
Eric, can you hear me?
Aunt Esther's words brought Eric back to reality.
I already called Gerald and told him you were here. He said he'd be here soon. I have to run to work. Bye-bye. See you soon, cheerio. Don't be bored, watch TV.
Aunt Esther left, and Eric sighed with relief. Half an hour later, Gerald arrived. He was very excited about Eric's arrival. Smiling broadly, he approached his cousin, but Eric held out his hand silently as before.
Hi.
Eric said as usual.
Hi.
Gerald replied, smiling. Gerald decided not to be bothered by Eric's complicated character. Thanks to his close acquaintance with Eric, which had taken place a few months ago, Gerald understood the complexity of his cousin's character, and he remembered that he himself had invited Eric to visit.
How are you, Eric?
I'm good.
That's great.
Gerald said with a smile. Gerald showed Eric his car. They drove around the city. Gerald showed the most beautiful parks and beaches. They went to the sea. It was very interesting. In the evening, Gerald said that tomorrow he had business that could not be postponed and offered Eric to walk in the nearest park. And in the evening, he promised to take him to a dance club. He said that it would be very fun and interesting. The next day, it happened. All day, Eric walked around the park. In the evening, Gerald arrived and they went to a dance club. There were a lot of people. It was very noisy and unaccustomedly stuffy. Gerald introduced Eric to his friends. They were very interested to see the northern guy, but his not smiling seemed to them rather rude, and they were not interested in him at once. Eric also felt uncomfortable in the club and went outside. It was quieter and calmer here. Eric sat down on the curb by the road. After a while, a noise caught his attention. Several teenagers were teasing the dog with long sticks. They were amused, and the animal was on the verge of pouncing and biting the teenagers. Eric's loud yell put the situation on pause. Both the teens and the dog looked surprised to see a large guy quickly approaching them. The bristling dog was already preparing to pounce on him. Eric quickly approached the animal, made a sharp, deceptive movement with his right hand past the dog's muzzle, and at the same moment with his left hand, he firmly grabbed the dog by the scruff of the neck and lifted him up. From the surprise, the dog was dazed for a second. In the next second, the dog realized the hopelessness of his situation and obediently hung down his front paws. His eyes were full of obedience to this strong man.
You can't!
Eric said, roughly and sharply, and looked intently into the dog's eyes. Then he turned to the teenagers and roughly shouted to them.
What are you standing? Get out of here and leave that animal alone.
The teenagers were frightened again, but no longer of the dog, but of the evil giant. They threw down their sticks and ran away.
What's up, dog?
Eric turned to the animal. He lowered the dog to the ground, rubbed his hand on its scruff, and stroked its head between its ears.
Good dog,
Eric said.
Now go.
Eric let go of the dog and went to the place where he had originally been and sat down on the curb by the road again. But the dog didn't run away. He obediently followed Eric and sat down next to him. At that time, Gerald came out of the club with 2 girls in his arms.
Eric, are you here? We were looking for you at the club. Who's this? What a surprise. Is this your new friend?
Said Gerald, laughing, pointing at the dog.
He must have lost his master. And he's hungry.
Don't feed the dog. He won't leave you alone.
Laughed Gerald, and the girls supported him with their laughter.
Let's go to the club.
No thanks. You go, Gerald, and I'll stay here.
Oh, all right. Wait for me here.
And Gerald went back to the club. Eric bought dog food at the store and fed the hungry dog. An hour later, Gerald came out of the club and got in the car.
Let's go.
He said to Eric. Eric opened the car door and the dog looked at Eric and got ready to jump in the car.
No, 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 no.
Gerald yelled.
I don't drive animals.
The dog stayed and they drove off. The next day, Gerald went away again and did not return until the evening. He smiled broadly, as always, and pretended that everything was as it should be and that it was all right. And the next day, it was the same. The day of Eric's departure home had arrived. Gerald smilingly wished his cousin a good trip and left again. Eric made his own way to the airport and boarded the plane. Eric felt disappointed with the trip. On the road, he thought about how home was better after all. Some are always warm, some are always colder, but everyone's home is different, and home is still better. He also thought about how different people are. Some people call him taciturn and rude, but he has never hurt anyone. Others always smile and say only nice things, but how are they better?
I just want to home.
Eric thought.
My mom's probably waiting for me, and Bella's probably missing me again.
Have you met people like Eric and Gerald in your life? Write your opinion about them in the comments.
If you liked the video, give it a like.